The fall that I arrived to serve alongside you at this congregation, I chose to answer the call of my colleagues of color and the group Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, and to preach about the white supremacist culture of this country. A risk, just a few months into a new ministerial settlement with a congregation that, although possessed of a racial justice committee that works so hard, was still a UU congregation with all the attendant demographic truths that that implies. Our congregation is over 90% white, and as far as I can tell, always has been. Standing up before you then to preach about the complicity of any of us who are white in a system of racism and oppression, one that benefits us at nearly every turn, whether we are poor or affluent. It felt somewhat risky, and it was. There was a certain degree of blowback after that service. Challenging white people, especially those who have struggled in their own lives, challenging them to see that they derive privileges from a system that their silence tacitly endorses, or worse, that their votes or money actively supports, can be met with anger, tears, fear. All those responses we have since talked about when we have talked about white fragility. And those terms, racism, white supremacy, and white fragility, even the distance creating phrase, white supremacist culture, they trigger many of us good liberals who have spent lifetimes working for justice and defining ourselves as good people. We bristle at what they mean, but they are indeed the right terms. America is a racist country with systems and institutions that prop up white supremacist culture, and all of us participate in that culture. If we are not actively opposing the forces of oppression and injustice, however we are able, then we are complicit. I believe this even more now than I did 4 years ago when we first started talking together about white supremacist culture. Last Sunday, we talked about all the different things that the insurrectionist attack on the Capitol forced us to confront, and today we dig deeper into the question of the seemingly perpetual racism of this country. Over 400 years ago, the first Black folks were stolen from their lives and forced to come to these shores where they were imprisoned, enslaved, subject to unholy, inhumane, horrifying treatment. The slavery of this nation was among the first to be based solely on race, rather than on war or on debt or on tribal dispute. A whole pseudo-scientific and false religious narrative grew that Black folks were different than others, not fully human, not real people. And it was elaborated and promulgated by whites in order to justify an economic system that feasted on the backs and blood and lives of human beings. And 400 years later, we continue to live every day with the stain of that foundational sin. This nation was built on slavery, literally, the buildings, the fields, our financial system, everything about who we have become. The sin of slavery touched everything that grew in this land, in every state, and it still does. Because the sin of slavery, even when that crime against humanity was made illegal, left behind beliefs taught from generation to generation that took that pseudoscience and made it live in the KKK, live in the failed reconstruction of the South, live in the prison industrial complex, live in the embedded racism of law enforcement and our judicial system, live in our lack of investment into education and healthcare. It is everywhere. And that is so plain in this moment in American history, as Black and brown bodies have not ceased to be killed in the streets by those meant to protect them, as Black and brown people die at shockingly higher rates from COVID, as neo-Nazi white supremacists make demands and attempt to wage a new civil war with Confederate flags and nooses. America is a racist country with systems and institutions that prop up white supremacist culture, and all of us participate in that culture. If we are not actively opposing the forces of oppression and injustice, however we are able, then we are complicit. This week, I have watched as more and more news has come out and more threats have been issued. Threats to Capitol buildings, to liberal religious churches, to other institutions of inclusion and welcome all across the country. I have watched, as I'm sure many of you have, as politicians on the far right have pretended to be confused about how what happened at the Capitol is any different from Black Lives Matter protests. I've watched as they've argued that this is time for unity and togetherness, or as they have stayed altogether silent. I've watched them spew their nonsense even as the masses who support them have mobilized across the country, literally calling for civil war. And I have wanted to scream, and sometimes I have screamed. False equivalencies, the rejection of truth, and attempts to live in the lowest common denominator will be the end of us all. Storming the Capitol with intent to commit violence, evidenced by explosive guns and zip ties, and to overturn a free and fair election is not the same as protesting largely peacefully 400 years of oppression and violence this country has visited on people of color's bodies, minds, lives, and families. Oppression and violence that continues to be visited every day. And frankly, even those protests against racism that have turned more violent, that have pulled down statues or occupied government buildings, those protests have at their heart the righteous cause of liberation and freedom. This insurrection, no matter what its proponents say, has at its heart oppression and prejudice, not love and liberation. The oppression and violence against people of color is so clear in the stark contrast between how the insurrection of last week was prepared for and how Black Lives Matter protests were prepared for. Our ongoing racism and oppression is clear in the response that was offered to this group of seditionists, and how across the country, Black Lives Matter groups have been met with the escalation of violence by law enforcement, the use of immediate force, often lethal force. Not all protests are created equally, either in their aims or in their methods. Think back to our Underground Railroad story today and the work of John Brown and others, and I'll say that again. Not all protests are created equally, and to argue that they are is to insult our collective intelligence. It also bears saying, though I can't believe it does, that conviction and might do not make right. One can believe they are right all they want, but some things are just actually factually wrong, and some things are just morally wrong. And I am, in truth, a believer in a certain degree of moral relativism, but that doesn't mean that everything and anything is equal and okay. Some things are just wrong. And opinion isn't all that matters. Reality and truth still matter, and they matter more than ever when forces of division, chaos, and hatred work tirelessly to manipulate our information and our opinions. There are just some of the things I have screamed this week. If any of us have ever doubted the racism of our shared system, I hope that those doubts have now faded, and we can all acknowledge that America is a racist country with systems and institutions that prop up white supremacist culture, and all of us participate in that culture. If we are not actively opposing the forces of oppression and injustice, however we are able, then we are complicit. This morning, as the nation recognizes this weekend the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I hope too that we are left not with paralyzing guilt or shame, but with broken hearts that are determined to become part of the solution rather than remain complicit in the problem. There are so many ways to become part of the solution out in the world: education, protest, voting, how we spend our money, advocacy, so many more. But this morning, I want to offer a way that this community, our congregation, brought together by shared values and a belief that it is in community that we find meaning and grow into our best selves. This morning, I want to offer a way that the Unitarian Society of Ridgewood can begin to become part of the solution. Our congregation, the Unitarian Society of Ridgewood, belongs to the Unitarian Universalist Association. As such, we sign on to those 7 principles I read to you at the beginning of our service. The principles began their history with the merger, or what is sometimes called the consolidation, of the Unitarians and the Universalists in 1961. These 2 different religions, one committed to the unity and interdependence of all things, and the other committed to the largest, most expansive vision of holy love, both caring less and less about dogma and more about justice, became one institution, and in that joining adopted 6 aspirational statements of belief and action. In their earliest incarnation, the principles covered the same ideals you hear in principles 1 to 6 to this day: inherent worth and dignity, democracy, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, peace and justice, support of each other. Those original statements were not come by easily, apparently. The wording was hotly debated. But a compromise was found, and those original principles lasted until 1984, when they were reformulated to use less sexist, more inclusive language. It was at that point, too, that the 7th principle was added to stress our relationship to the whole of existence. That original set of 6 lasted over 20 years, and this new set has lasted well over 30, experiencing only minor tweaks along the way. The principles we read now are the only ones I, a lifelong UU, have ever known. Too often, our principles are treated like creed, even in our creedless faith. But they are not statements of faith. They are statements describing our shared values. They are aspirational calls to an ethical life. And most importantly, they are subject to change and review and renewal and regeneration. They were intended to be reviewed every 15 years or so. We call ourselves a living tradition, a living religion. We embrace this term because we know that always we are learning more about ourselves, about humanity, about the world we share, and that to be honest and relevant, we must incorporate what we learn into our worldview and into our meaning making and into our spirit. James Luther Adams, the 20th century Unitarian liberal theologian, wrote that religious liberalism depends on the principle that revelation is continuous. We have shared core values, but nothing about Unitarian Universalism is meant to be static. It's meant to be dynamic, living and growing and changing as the world lives and grows and changes. And I defy anyone to argue that we have not changed as a denomination and as a world drastically since 1984. In an article written in 2000 for the UU World magazine, an article describing the history of the principles, Warren R. Ross concluded with these words: "Nonetheless, no one at the moment is suggesting any drastic revisions." This was in 2000. "And yet the commitment to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, as the 4th principle puts it, carries the seeds of its own obsolescence. Just consider, well into the 20th century, our Unitarian predecessors used to proclaim and teach their children that we believe in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the leadership of Jesus, salvation through character, and the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. Quite apart from the fact that we tend not to use so many capital letters, we would today have difficulty saying those words without embarrassment and lots of sickness. Yet the people who did say them were just as intelligent, as in tune with their times, and as committed to reason and free thinking as we are." Roth continues, "In 2020, he writes, when everyone presumably will have perfect vision, our current principles and purposes may also be perceived to have inadequacies that demand radical rewriting, and therein lies our genius. It's a process that is rightly called renewal or regeneration, and that is what has not changed, and let us hope will remain unchanged 20 or even 100 years from now." Well, 2020 is just in the rearview mirror, and despite what Ross predicted, perfect vision we did not have. But what has remained unchanged is our commitment as a faith to growing and changing with the world. We don't always do it perfectly, but we have a deep desire to do it, to grow our circles wider, to expand what we mean by welcome, to live our social justice more fully. A re-examination of our principles is, I would argue, somewhat long overdue. For the last 7 years, a small and dedicated group of Unitarian Universalists led by Paula Cole-Jones and Bruce Pollock Johnson has promoted an 8th principle. I offer you the text again. We covenant to affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. As always, we are UUs after all. The text will likely be wordsmithed as this proposed principle makes its way through our UUA process. But the sentiments are really what matter. What this proposed principle says is, spiritual wholeness is predicated on living in a world of beloved community. Beloved community will only be created through actively working to dismantle racism and oppression. We must be accountable in that work for it to succeed. You may have heard me say in the past that even those of us who benefit from our white privileging institutions suffer the effects of a racist system because it impoverishes our souls. We might benefit materially, but we suffer morally and spiritually. Spiritual wholeness, real spiritual wholeness, isn't possible when we live in a world where others are denied their wholeness. None of us are free until all of us are free. We will not find true wholeness until each and every one of us lives in beloved community. Martin Luther King Jr. was among those who made that phrase, beloved community, come to life. It means a diverse, liberated, free, justice-oriented community that lives with that big love for all humankind that we talk about. That kind of holy love that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with understanding that we are one human family, interconnected and interdependent. When we get there, to that place where love reigns and all are free, then spiritual wholeness might be ours. Beloved community doesn't magically happen overnight. It doesn't only happen through laws, though we know that laws done well can help protect people. It doesn't only happen through prayer or wishful thinking, or even only through educating ourselves and expanding our own minds. The beloved community will only come to exist when we work to make it exist. With our votes, our money, our time, our words, our prayers, our actions, our bodies, our lives. We must all use the gifts we are given, all the privileges we have. Every action we take must work to dismantle and undermine the systems that prevent beloved community. To create is a verb. It takes action, attention, work, and time to create the beloved community, and it takes all of us. But committing to action as grand and as big and as long-term as the creation of beloved community is hard. It can be easy to fall down, to be unsure how to get back up, or even to be unsure where to begin. And we UUs are so good with words that sometimes we forget to follow them up with actions. Real, long-term, determined action. This has become all the more challenging in a world which satisfies our demands so readily. Working for a beloved community we might never see can be daunting. And so accountability becomes an absolute necessity. Not for nothing, our Unitarian forebears understood that they had a responsibility to each other for mutual care and mutual accountability. Despite their desire for independence, one they achieved through congregational polity, they were also sure to express their expectations for support and challenge across congregational lines, and they committed to these relationships together. They were supposed to intervene congregation to congregation when they needed to. Just as we believe that individuals are better able to grow and learn in community, so too congregations and institutions are better able to grow and learn in community. Accountability must be present. It would be easy to claim that this eighth principle is implied by all the others. But truly, the sentiments of the eighth principle capture something both new in the commitment to beloved community and accountability, and it addresses something long left too silent in our denomination and others. And I know it would also be easy to say, why racism when other oppressions like misogyny and transphobia and homophobia clearly exist in this country too. But think back over these past weeks. Think about how segregated our congregations, our schools, our towns still are. Think about the realities of this country for the last 400 years and the deeply uncomfortable truth that racism was at the heart of this country's founding. Racism is at the center of what's happening now. It has always been at the center. Racism and other oppressions, as it is phrased in the proposed principle, captures the deep truth of American history. For 60 years, the core values of our principles have been the same, and they have not spoken directly to this foundational sin of slavery and racism, and the ongoing oppression that is its legacy. Right now, the forces of racism and oppression are undeniably and violently trying to bring this country to its knees. We ought to have addressed our brokenness head-on decades or centuries ago, but it's not too late. Right here, right now, with this eighth principle, we can begin here in this community by acknowledging, along with other congregations that have adopted this principle by congregational vote, that we need a new principle that speaks directly to systems of oppression and racism. We can begin to do in earnest the work of accountability, of building the beloved community for all. May we be bold in our risk-taking and bold in our change-making.